Hi everybody, thank you for coming to our session. I'm Andrew Knight and this is Billy Nicholles, and we're going to start by just introducing ourselves for 5 minutes. We'll have our PowerPoint presentation for 35 or 40 and Q&A at the end. As was mentioned, if you can type your questions into the app, ideally we'll deal with them that way. Just to draw your attention to the table on the side there, we've actually got a whole bunch of samples of vegan pet food. Some you can take away for dogs in particular, and some are just to look at. And we've also got some really cool handouts. I'll be running through this environmental one during my presentation, and Billy's just led a piece in plant-based news, so we've got copies for that of that as well, and that summarises a lot of the key information we're going to provide. So I'm Andrew. I'm originally from Australia, where I helped to launch the national campaign against the live sheep export trade in the late 1990s, and that's the biggest, most long-distance live sheep trade in the world. And I wanted to, I strategized about how I could have even bigger impact and be taken more seriously and learn more about animal welfare science to support campaigns. And I thought I should become a veterinarian, actually. So I went into veterinary school and I nearly failed because I had to go sideways into a huge campaign not to kill animals in the curriculum, which we ultimately won. And so after that, it's a really interesting story for another time. But after that, I went to the UK, practiced small animal veterinary medicine for around about a decade, mostly around London. Then I became a veterinary professor in academia. I'm now affiliated with 3 universities, including a major veterinary school in Australia. I'm a vet professor of animal welfare, and I've spent the last several years doing research into vegan pet food and recently completed a PhD on that, and I'll be summarising a lot of that research this morning.
And hello everyone, my name's Billy. I've not done quite as much as Andrew, but trying to catch up. And I've been an animal advocate and interested in these topics for about 2.5 years now. And quite early on in that time, I was also thinking about where I'd be best placed and what I could best do to maximize my impact. And I went to a conference where I met Andrew and heard a talk very, very similar to the one you're going to hear today. And that really inspired me to focus my time working on animal companion dietary change and vegan pet food. So who knows who's going to catch the bug next? Certainly we need people, so hopefully this is inspiring to you as well. Since then, I've been working as a researcher at Bryant Research, focusing specifically at the moment on the environmental impacts of meat-based versus vegan diets. And I'm also working at a vegan pet food company called Omni, growing very fast. We're recently on Dragon's Den. There's some samples over there. Thank you very much. So also having one foot in the business world as well, selling to consumers in lots of different places, shopping malls, high streets, all sorts of different places, vegan markets, hearing what the concerns that guardians, both vegan and not, have around vegan pet food, and trying to optimize the communications and the strategy we have to trying to convince people to transition to these diets. Yeah. I'll leave to Andrew now to talk about the health benefits, and I'll be up a little bit later to talk about the environmental benefits.
So we're talking about vegan pet food, and to many people the idea that dogs and cats could possibly be healthy on vegan diets is outrageous, because we often think of them as carnivores. As a matter of fact, dogs have been co-evolving with our ancestors for the last 20 to 40,000 years. As we roamed around the landscape as hunter-gatherer bands, hunting large game animals, but also, in particular, subsisting on starchy root vegetables. They were the mainstay of our ancestors' diets. So our ancestors were followed around the landscape by wolf packs, and the wolf packs were interested in scraps of meat from the kills that our ancestors made. Some of those wolves were a bit more confident and had better temperaments than some of the other wolves, and they would approach more closely to our human campfires. And over time, they started to somehow collaborate a bit with our ancestors, and they've spent 20 to 40,000 years learning to manipulate humans into giving them food scraps, and also understanding human behavior. They're virtually the only species that understands what it means, for example, to point. So they've learned to understand human communication to a degree. Some of these wolves had genetic mutations that enabled them to derive some nutritional benefit from starchy root vegetable scraps and other sort of mixed food scraps from our early campsites. Those wolf hybrids did better than the wolves that didn't have those mutations, and over time the population changed from carnivorous wolves to domesticated dogs who are biologically omnivorous and do quite well on diet of mixed human food scraps. Cats haven't had the same ancestry. They have been co-evolving with our ancestors for about 8 to 10,000 years, and their role has been different. Their role has been to basically guard our grain stores, our food stores from rodents. So they've been encouraged to hang around our settlements to actually hunt rodents. So they've remained very much biologically carnivorous. This is pretty relevant to modern domesticated dogs and cats, both of who consume lots of body parts from animals they'd never naturally hunt. Think of cows, pigs, chickens, fish, for example, mixed together with all sorts of unnatural additives, packaged up into formulations such as dry kibble, and fed at predictable times daily. So this is quite far removed from the natural feeding regime of an ancestral dog or cat. Nowadays, people are increasingly choosing plant-based diets for themselves, but also for their dogs and cats for all these sorts of reasons. People are increasingly concerned about health and longevity, also for their dogs and cats, which are more often seen as members of our own families. They're living longer. People are wanting better standards of care, veterinary care, and also better diets for them. People are increasingly concerned about the environmental impacts of the food animal sector. We know it's the biggest cause of deforestation on the planet. I'll be talking more, and Billy will be talking more about that later on. We now kill about 93 billion land animals in the food system each year. That's more than 10 animals for every person on the planet, as well as about 1 to 3 trillion fish and marine animals. Of the farmed animals, 90% plus are intensively farmed at very high stocking densities, in conditions that are very deprived environmentally, with minimal opportunity to exercise highly motivated behavioural needs. This is chronically stressful to these animals, and then virtually all of them are killed at a very premature stage of life. So people are increasingly concerned about the animal welfare and the ethical implications of this intensive animal farming. We also have a food justice issue as well. Despite the passage of decades, the number of people suffering from hunger and malnutrition around the world doesn't seem to be dropping. It's around about 1 in every 9 people on the planet. And this is because the consumption of grain essentially is very inequitable around the world. This varies from just under 30 kilograms per person per year in developing nations to more than 96 kilograms per person per year in highly developed nations such as the UK, actually. And that's because in highly developed nations, we don't consume most of that grain directly. We consume it indirectly in the form of livestock products. When we feed grain to food animals, most of that grain doesn't directly produce usable meat, milk, and eggs. It actually supports the bodily maintenance processes of livestock animals and is essentially lost during the conversion process. So it's a really inefficient way of producing food. So although we actually produce enough grain to feed around about double the human population of the Earth, we would actually need 7 planet Earths to produce enough grain to feed everybody if we were to consume the grain-rich diet of the world's wealthiest 20 countries. So there's actually a really big food justice concern as well because of our overconsumption of livestock produce. Because of all these sorts of factors, people are increasingly interested in these sorts of alternatives, certainly plant-based alternatives, including yeast and seaweed actually. I have over there on the side table a whole bunch of these from Omni and other UK pet food companies and international pet food companies that are now producing vegan products, so please do go and have a look at those. We also have cultured meat-based pet food. The first cultured meat-based product was actually released onto the market in February of this year. This is a world first, to be honest, and it involved cultivated chicken, which was produced within a dog food and went on sale in London. So here's a packet of it, and there's more on the side table there that you can have a look at. And because it was the only one in the world, this is the first time this has happened, I was determined not to lose any of my very precious cultivated meat-based dog food. And I said, I'm not giving that up for anything, until they said, actually, would you like to feed it to dogs on Dutch television? I went, absolutely, you can have all my food. So sadly, it's empty now, which is really frustrating. And I believe, sadly, it's actually sold out in London, so I've been told, which is also very frustrating. Do watch this space. Here's another one that is coming. This is cultivated ocean fish to be used in cat treats. This is going through FDA approval in the US. It's not on the marketplace yet. And there is another one apparently undergoing approval in Prague at the moment. So that's really exciting. Finally, we have cultivated meat-based pet food, or we had until it sold out. And we also have cellular agriculture. So this is precision fermentation of microorganisms to produce protein directly in this case. This is the company Callista in China. They have a huge production plant there, which, although it looks quite large, actually takes a tiny amount of land compared to vast acres of land to grow feed crops to feed to livestock animals and also to graze animals at pasture. So it uses this amount of land, a little bit of water, and that goes into, along with offcuts of the cane sugar industry. This is in a cane sugar growing area, so that the waste offcuts go into these giant cylinders, and you can see the long steel cylinders there. There's two of them, there's about 50 meters long, and they produce actually protein directly. And I've got a little tube of that on the table on the side. You can see what the protein powder actually looks like, and it goes into this wonderful pet food. Sorry, I have it right here actually. So there we go. This is the powder. This is the protein gets produced, and the cultivated meat stuff is now kind of old history compared to this. This is even newer. It's gone into this. This is the world's first microbial protein-based dog food, and it came out about 3 weeks ago from a German company. And they've kindly supplied a whole bunch of smaller free samples on the side table there. There's 20 of them. They're for dogs. And I don't have any more. So if you are interested, after the talk, go there and grab yourselves a little packet of this really interesting product. So now we have microbial fermented pet food as well. Here's another example. We have myalgae. We know that omega-3 is important for animals and for people, and the normal way to get that has been to eat fish, which in turn eat the algae. But this Scottish company, myalgae, now has these fermentation vats, and again, very little land, very little water. They don't feed in cane sugar, it's in Scotland, so they feed in byproducts of the whiskey industry. And this grows these microalgae directly, and now we just harvest the microalgae to get omega-3, and they say they cut out the middle fish as a way to provide the omega-3 directly. So that's all great. How fast is this sector growing? It's actually growing really quickly. You can see the figures here. It was worth about $10 billion globally. Within context, the total pet food industry is worth well over $100 billion globally. $10 billion globally in 2010, more than doubling, nearly tripling within 4 years, and is expected to more than double again up to $57 billion within the next 10 years. So it's growing very quickly. The total pet food sector is growing, but the vegan pet food sector is growing about 6 times faster, actually, than the total pet food sector. There is increasing pet ownership globally, which is partly driving all of this. And as I said, those concerns in the beginning about environmental sustainability and so on are driving this. To work out what proportion of pet guardians would realistically be interested in choosing all of these vegan pet foods and cultivated meat-based pet foods, we conducted the biggest survey of pet owners in 2020, and there were more than 4,000 dog and cat owners. We found that 54% of them currently feeding conventional or raw meat said that they would not be interested in choosing alternatives, but 46% would have been. That's almost half. There was another survey in North America that found that a bit over a third of those North American people would be interested. We found almost a half. That's a lot of people would be interested. The most popular alternative was actually laboratory-grown meat, but unfortunately that's not going to be available at scale for some years, followed by vegetarian and vegan options, which are widely available, certainly online, so that's good news. We looked at all the factors the alternative diets would need to provide in order that people would realistically be willing to choose them, and there were many, and the top 5 were these ones here. People wanted to be reassured that the health outcomes for their cats and dogs would be good, that the diets would be nutritionally sound, that of good quality, that they'd be palatable so their pets would enjoy eating them, and also that they'd be environmentally sustainable. So my research since 2020 has been focused on each of these 5 areas, and we've now got a body of research actually fulfilling all of these needs. For example, this is the biggest study looking at the health outcomes of dogs fed either conventional meat, raw meat, or vegan diets, and we had more than 2,500 dogs in this study. We wanted to assess whether dogs on each of these 3 diets had needed to visit vets an unusually high number of times, because that could indicate some kind of an illness, whether they'd needed any kind of medications in the last year or not, whether they'd need to progress on to a medical diet of some kind or after initially being on a vegan diet or one of the meat-based diets, What was the assessment of their veterinarian about the health of their dog if they'd seen a vet in the last year? What was their own opinion about the health of their dog? What percentage of these dogs was unwell? And if they were unwell, did they suffer from just one health disorder or was it more than one? What was the average number of cases of illness per unwell dog? We also looked at 22 of the most common health disorders in dogs. And we found that for all of those 7 general indicators of illness, which you can see across the x-axis at the bottom, increased vet visits, medication usage, and so on, after we controlled for differences in the diet groups in age, sex, neutering status, exercise level, and breed size, we found that dogs fed the vegan diets indicated by the green dots, and also sometimes dogs fed the raw meat diets indicated by the orange dots, had lower odds of having these indicators of illness compared to dogs fed conventional meat, which was indicated by the dashed horizontal line. We went further and calculated for an average dog of average age, sex, neutering status, exercise level, and so on, what would the chances be of having these indicators of illness, which are indicated by the rows, the increased medication usage and so on? What would the chances be if they were on a conventional meat-based diet? That's the first numerical column. The vegan diet, that's the second column. And then what was the reduction on a vegan diet? And the reduction when fed vegan diets varied from 14% up to 51%. You can see that in the final column. So pretty substantial reductions in most indicators of illness when all these dogs were consuming vegan diets. We did the same thing comparing dogs fed vegan diets with dogs fed raw meat. And this is the same table for that. You can see there's substantial reductions in most categories on the vegan diet as well, but not all of them. There's a couple for which there were increases, and we think that that's actually because of non-dietary factors in the case of people feeding raw meat. The total percentage of animals that were unwell was about half of those fed conventional meat, 43% of those fed raw meat, and just over a third of those fed vegan diets. And when they were unwell, the average cases of illness, as you can see there, 1.65 for dogs fed conventional meat and about 1.5 for the other 2 dietary groups. The 22 most common health disorders in all of these dogs was top of the list, gastrointestinal problems, very common in dogs, then skin and coat problems, other musculoskeletal problems, and so on. So the chances of suffering from one of these disorders was highest when dogs were fed conventional meat. For 11 out of 22, that's half of them. Highest when dogs were fed raw meat for 8 out of 22, that's most of the rest. And highest when dogs were fed vegan diets for 3 out of 22. So it was obvious that after doing all of that, that the healthiest diets, also the least dietary hazards, which are very common in raw meat-based diets, were vegan diets, but they do need to be well formulated to be nutritionally sound. So we published that study in the Open Access Scientific Journal, PLOS One, one of the world's biggest peer-reviewed general science journals, and follow-up study controlling for differences in dietary groups and quantifying precisely what the benefits were on the vegan diets. These attracted huge interest. These were reported in more than 400 news outlets globally, including feature article in New Scientist here. This was the Channel 9 Australia News website. After the second study got published, there were more than 1,000 comments on their website in the first 24 hours. So huge interest in these studies. This was published in The Spectator here in the UK about 5 days ago. It's online. It's a fantastic feature article all about this. So interest is ongoing. However, I don't think any of that's as exciting as this. This is actually a study published by Dr. Sarah Dodd. So she's a veterinary nutritional specialist who, like myself, has done a PhD on vegan pet food. And she's been leading a team who's published about a third of the studies in this area, as we have done as well, at Guelph Veterinary School, which is a leading veterinary school in Canada. And this is one of her studies. So they looked at nearly 1,200 dog guardians, including, as you can see, about more than 350 feeding vegan diets for about 3 years on average, very long period. Initially, nothing dramatic. Vegan diets more likely to be in very good health, less likely to suffer from gastrointestinal and liver disorders, exactly what they found in the cats, interestingly, and also ocular disorders, which they didn't find in the cats. So far, that looks like most of the studies in the field. This is the exciting part here, the really exciting part. They looked at the lifespans of more than 1,200 previously owned dogs to see how old they were when they passed away. And the dogs fed the plant-based diets, the purely vegan diets, were indicated by the green curve. They appeared to be living longer than dogs fed conventional meat or mixed meat and vegan diets, indicated by the other two curves. This was also the chart that they got for cats. In cats, the difference wasn't statistically significant, but in the dogs it was. So this wasn't a random sampling variation almost certainly. This is probably a true biological difference. This is a statistically significant difference that equates to around about an extra decade of life, slightly more actually, in a human being. And think what it would mean if you had an extra decade, or one of your loved ones had an extra decade of life. Think what that would mean. On top of that, we know these dogs aren't just living longer. They seem to be also living better, because across all of the 11 studies now looking at health outcomes, there are two consistent clusters of healthcare benefits that seem to be arising repeatedly across the studies. One seems to be associated with not consuming animal-sourced allergens in the diet. About 80% of dietary allergens are actually animal-based and 20% are plant-based in dogs. So when you cut out the animal-sourced allergens, the dogs who have sensitivities, allergies, have a reduction in itchy skin, ear canal problems, gastrointestinal problems. These are super common in dogs. They were two of the top 3 most common health disorders, if you perhaps recall on the chart. Second benefit seems to be that for dogs that are overweight and obese, and that's 50% of all dogs today, they seem to lose weight and come down to a healthy body weight, whereas the ones that are already normal weights don't go underweight. Related benefits are improved mobility in dogs, a reduction in musculoskeletal problems. So both of these clusters of benefits are likely to positively impact quality of life. Not just living longer, they seem to be living better as well, according to the evidence out there. So that's super exciting for dogs. There are now 12 studies or vets' master's theses and a systematic review of all. They're examining health outcomes in dogs on vegetarian or vegan diets. And if you click on my website, sustainablepetfood.info under health, you get a page with a short sort of 1-paragraph summary of each of these studies, linking through to the full text study, which is freely available on the internet, so you can see them all. 11 out of 12 indicate equivalent or superior health outcomes using vegan or vegetarian diets. The one that doesn't is the oldest, smallest study with the least realistic study conditions. What about cats? Well, for cats, we did the same kind of thing. We had more than 1,300 cats, so this is the largest study that's been done. Because of smaller numbers of cats fed raw meat diets, we didn't have a separate group. We just included them with the conventional meat, so we had just one group of meat-based versus vegan diets for cats. We looked at the same 7 general indicators of illness across the x-axis, and you can see that after controlling in the cats for differences in age, sex, neutering status, but also in the cat's location, because we thought, hang on, maybe some of these plant-based cats might be going outdoors and hunting. So we controlled for location, actually. After controlling for all those things, we found that cats fed vegan diets, indicated by the blue dots, had reductions in indicators of illness for all 7 of these general indicators of illness compared to cats fed meat, indicated by the dashed horizontal line. As for the dogs, we calculated for an average cat, average age, sex, location, neutering status, and so on. What would the risks be of all these 7 indicators of illness indicated by the rows? When fed when fed meat in the first column, vegan diets in the second column, and there were significant reductions actually in the risks of indicators of illness on vegan diets. You can see in the third column that varied from about 4% up to 55%, so some pretty big reductions across many of the categories there, in fact most of them, on the vegan diets. The percentage of cats that was unwell was 42% fed meat, 37% fed vegan diets. If they were unwell, 1.6 cases of illness per unwell cat when fed meat, and 1.3 when fed vegan diets on average. The 22 most common health disorders were slightly different from those in dogs. In cats, they were dental and oral, top of the list, followed by body weight. Unfortunately, about half of all cats are also overweight and obese today. And then gastrointestinal. And the chances of suffering from one of these 22 disorders was highest when they were fed meat for 2/3 of them, highest when they were fed vegan diets for 1/3 of them. Hardly any of these differences were statistically significant, but overall they certainly do constitute a strong trend. So it's obvious again that in the case of cats, the healthiest diets once again were the vegan diets. But again, it's really important that they are nutritionally sound. You do need to get them from responsible pet food companies that are working with veterinary nutritionists, fully supplementing the diets, making sure that they are nutritionally sound. This study was also published, open access, peer-reviewed, also in PLOS One, again attracted huge press attention. With respect to the cat studies, there's now 3 studies. Like the dog studies, there's 3 in cats, examining health outcomes with fed vegan or vegetarian diets. Almost all of these relate to vegan diets, by the way. Same with dogs. Again, if you click on sustainablepetfood.info health, you'll get the cat studies. And again, there's a short summary of each study linking through to the full text study. All 3 support the use of these diets in cats. There are no credible studies showing that cats fed vegan diets have worse health outcomes. There just aren't any. All of the studies show that they do as well or better. So this obviously satisfies. I think this body of evidence. We've now got 11 studies in dogs, 3 in cats. Collectively, that's a bigger body of evidence that exists to support the use of virtually any other dietary choices for animals, and virtually any veterinary healthcare interventions of any kind. That's drugs and medicines. You don't see 11 studies describing benefits. You might see 1 or 2 or even 0. So this is much bigger than the body of evidence that exists to support virtually all other veterinary healthcare interventions. I've got some studies actually surveying not animals and health outcomes, but rather companies to see whether there were differences in steps taken to ensure nutritional soundness, which I'm not going to show you, unfortunately, because I don't have time. But essentially, I surveyed about 27 companies and found that the companies producing the vegan diets were producing them to nutritional standards just as good as the meat-based diets. In fact, slightly better overall, probably because the diets are more controversial. The companies are going the extra mile, I think, to make sure that they are properly nutritionally supplemented and nutritionally sound. So I'm going to skip all that and go straight to the palatability question, because critics will often say, but hang on, isn't it cruel to feed these carnivores vegetarian or vegan diets? Surely this is animal abuse. And in order to address this point, Jed Gillen, in his wonderful book Obligate Carnivore, says, actually, dogs and cats seem to have the capacity to enjoy ingredients that are entirely unnatural to them on quite a regular basis. And he says, if you're not sure about this point, consider cat food. And he says, try this experiment at home. He says, skip your cat's breakfast one morning and bring him or her to the beach instead. Study your cat closely. Driven by hunger, what natural instincts do you think might kick in? What are the chances that your cat will splash into the water, swim 50 or so miles out in a deep ocean, and thereby engage a 1,200-pound animal, because an adult tuna fish can be as large as a horse, if you can actually find any, because they're kind of going extinct almost, in an underwater battle to the death in order to fulfill the natural feline diet of fish? The idea that fish is a natural food for cats is absurd. They are descended from desert creatures and are notoriously hydrophobic. Have you ever tried giving your cat a bath? So he makes the point, much better than I could, that obviously they have the ability to enjoy ingredients that are entirely unnatural to them. However, some people say, oh, I don't believe in about it. It's still very cruel to force cats to eat these diets. So I think more useful than people arguing back and forth to each other is, why don't we just ask the animals? So how do we ask the animals? Well, obviously we study their behavior at feeding times. So we've done this as well. There've been a bunch of smaller studies previously, but we did the largest ones in dogs and cats and published those about 2 or 3 years ago. So with dogs, there were more than 2,300 dogs on conventional meat, raw meat and vegan diets. We studied every known indicator of palatability, how much they enjoy their diets that had ever been described in science or that we're aware of from our experience as vets. And you'll recognize many of these yourself. You don't have to be a vet to know that you might have seen dogs wolf their food down, rush up to their food bowl, wag their tail, sniff and jump and bark and so on. You'll recognize a lot of this yourself. We did a similar thing with cats. We had more than 1,100 cats in these 3 different dietary groups. And with cats, the indicators were different. There were 15 indicators of palatability. There seemed to be a lot of sniffing, flicking of tails, flicking of ears, cautious investigations, licking of lips and food bowls and things like that in fussy cats, perhaps. So the first thing we did was we analysed how likely the dogs and cats were to display all these behaviours when fed the different diets. And we are able to identify some of these as co-varying consistently with each other and previous scientific studies. And we're able to identify some as being positive indicators and some as being negative indicators of palatability. Having figured this out, we then look to see whether positive and negative ones varied across the 3 different diets. And after doing all that and then looking for statistically significant differences and analysing it to death statistically, we discovered that at the end of the day, there's no significant difference, pretty much. There's a couple of tiny variations, but overall, there was certainly no reduction in palatability when fed vegan diets. So, and this concurred actually with the results of the prior studies, which were smaller. So there's obviously no evidence that actually vegan diets are less palatable. And actually, this is common sense. If a company produces these diets commercially, tries to sell them, they're not palatable, they'll be rapidly out of business. So clearly, this works. So that's the results when looking at thousands of animals. But, and as I say, we published that also in PLOS 1 in 2021, I think it was. And we tried this for real. As I said, I had this wonderful cultivated meat-based pet food. I was determined not to lose until they said, actually, would you like to feed it to dogs on Dutch television? So about 2 weeks ago, I found myself in Amsterdam. I said, absolutely, you can have all my sample. So it's now sadly empty. But it's quite stressful, to be honest, when you have cameras rolling and you have this, not experimental, but almost experimental diet down there. So we had cultivated meat-based food. We had some of this microbial protein dog food. We had actually Omni pet food, a normal vegan pet food as well. And Billy is associated with Omni, and I knew that if the dogs refused to eat the Omni on television, I'd be answering to him and the rest of his company, and these other companies as well. So it's quite stressful, to be honest. And thankfully, they absolutely just wolfed all of those diets down very fast, especially that brown dog Zelda just right in front of me there. Who came in like a shark and just devoured the whole lot very quickly, anything that was left. So I have none to show you because they've eaten it, and it was highly palatable when we tested it on camera anyway, thankfully. So I keep my job perhaps. Anyway, and now I'm going to hand over to Billy to talk about the environmental sustainability aspects next. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. We also had, hours of terrifying Zoom calls trying to work out how we would feed Omni food to 5 dragons on Dragon's Den and make sure that the dog would eat it. Really, really scary. But we got there in the end. The dogs enjoyed it. So thank you for your research and for your presentation. Now, I think we can all agree that Andrew's done some amazing work here, doing a lot of research to show that a lot of the concerns consumers have around vegan pet foods, they don't need to have them. Clearly some really strong health benefits here. Clearly palatability is an issue, but there's another question people have as well, and that's environmental sustainability. And it's actually not an argument that I think a lot of the general public and a lot of us as animal advocates are particularly well versed in, the environmental sustainability of meat-based versus vegan pet food. What are the environmental paw prints of dogs and cats? So that's something that we set out to look into in more detail recently. We conducted a forthcoming comprehensive study on the current state of knowledge on the environmental paw prints of these 2 companion animals. And I'll just give a little bit of more detail into what we found now. So I guess the first thing to say, at the risk of preaching to the activists, because we all know this already, obviously, but dietary change is an environmental imperative. So we know that food systems in general account for about 1/3 of annual human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that the livestock sector accounts for a particularly outsized proportion of that, at least 20%, probably a little bit more. And we also know, to a lot of our dismay and concern, animal product production and consumption is rising globally. Clearly, the food we eat, and particularly the high level of animals that we eat, is a significant issue for environmental sustainability. Now, that argument is well accepted in these circles, and it's becoming more accepted in the general population as well. But when I say we, I think most people are thinking humans, right? We're thinking people in this room. But what about our dogs and cats? Should we be thinking about these groups as well? And should we be including those groups in that collective we when we talk about dietary change? I suppose historically it maybe is understandable that we haven't been thinking about this. We've kind of assumed, based on an absence of evidence to the contrary that vegan diets aren't healthy for dogs and cats. Fortunately, that's now changed, as Andrew has showed you. So we should examine that now. And there's a couple of points that I think are relevant here to prime this discussion. There's over 1 billion dogs and cats now globally. This is a huge, huge population of animals, a collective biomass of 22 million tons. So they're consuming really significant amounts of resources here. And secondly, a significant proportion of those resources that they're consuming are animal-based ingredients. They're ingredients that we all know are terrible for the environment. So this is a really important statistic, and Andrew will talk more about this later, but globally, 9% of all farmed land animals are consumed by dogs and cats globally, almost one in 10. In the US, and probably other wealthy nations with high companion animal populations like the UK, this rises to 20%. And that's basically the statistic that got me interested in this field. That's a huge, huge number. And we as animal advocates are talking a lot about human dietary change, when actually in places like the UK and the US, we're looking at about a fifth of the farmed land animals that are being consumed. They're not being consumed by humans at all. They're actually being consumed by dogs and cats. So I think that really motivates this issue, at least to me and hopefully to you as well. And it makes me think we do need to look into this. We need to think about what we can do to mitigate those impacts. It's certainly an issue, and these are significant impacts. But actually, I think this is also a really big opportunity, right? This is an opportunity for us to mitigate some impacts that currently we haven't really been looking at and thinking about too significantly. So just to, I guess, break down how these environmental impacts affect dogs and cats and quantify them slightly. Firstly, ingredient choice matters the most. That's the first thing to know. Again, probably not surprising. When you think about all of the factors that influence a dog or cat's paw print, their diet, obviously, but also the feces they produce, the waste products, the accessories that you might buy for them, a lead or maybe a nice toy, those all have impacts, but diet is by far the most important one. Within diet, obviously, because animal-based ingredients are significant here, ingredient choice is the most environmentally relevant factor influencing these paw prints. So essentially, if we want to reduce the environmental impact of our dogs and cats, what we need to be thinking about is what are we feeding them? To give some more color on that, what we're feeding them at the moment is resulting in really huge environmental impacts. As I said, there's a high proportion of animal-based ingredients in dog and cat diets at the moment. Just over half of all ingredients in pet food are currently animal-based. And a couple of statistics just to give some color on the extent of these impacts, how significant they are. In the US, 25% to 30% of the environmental impact of livestock production have been attributed to companion animal diets. So any US colleagues here who are working on dietary change, who are talking about the environmental impacts of dietary change, looking about a quarter of those impacts are actually relevant for our dogs and cats. So if we're not including them in the discussion, this seems like a really big blind spot, something we should address quite quickly. And another one that I think is really interesting, a study in Japan that found that the environmental impact of just a medium-sized dog's diet was actually greater than the impact of a Japanese person's diet. So again, we're focusing so much on humans, but actually dogs are seemingly just as important here in some cases. And obviously you can go larger, large dogs will have even greater impact still. So this is clearly something that we really need to be paying attention to. If you want to get more information on these statistics and see how it breaks down, we have a forthcoming study that will hopefully be published quite soon. And in the meantime, we have a handout that summarizes these impacts in plant-based news that you can have a look at as well. But there is something that we should be addressing here. It's probably crossed your minds already. What about animal byproducts, right? This is the big thing that people tend to say to sort of excuse this issue, to say that maybe this isn't as big of a problem. Animal byproducts, surely these are ingredients that are just waste products of the human industry. They would be thrown in landfill anyway, and so we don't really have to worry about them from an environmental perspective. That's certainly what many animal agricultural bodies would like you to believe, and there are groups like the National Renders Association in the US that have quite large communication campaigns saying things like rendering is recycling, and if you're not using animal byproducts, they would be wasted anyway, and so it's an environmental positive. However, this is very unlikely to be the case. First thing of note here is that while it's generally assumed that animal byproducts would otherwise be wasted if not used in pet food, this is not the case. In fact, Pet food is a minority user of animal byproducts. Only about 25%, I believe, in the US of animal byproducts are used for pet food. And there's lots of other industries that would soak up this demand as well and are soaking it up. Pharmaceuticals, chemicals, fertilizers, feed for other farmed animals as well. So these wouldn't be wasted if not used in pet food. And the other relevant point here is that while we assume that surely the impact of animal byproducts compared to human grade meat would probably be diminished in some way, actually recent studies have found the opposite. They've actually found that the environmental impacts associated with animal byproducts are greater than those associated with human grade meat when used in pet food. So why is that? Well, animal byproducts used for pet food make up only a minority of the animal carcasses. So on average, between 31 to 39% of the farmed animals used for pet food are animal byproducts, and the rest is human grade meat. That means that these are actually a less efficient ingredient to use in pet food, and you're going to need more livestock animals to feed companion animals using animal byproducts. 1.4 times more livestock animals for dogs and 1.9 times more animals for cats. So imagine you've got 1 kilogram of animal byproducts and 1 kilogram of human grade meat. You're going to need, and you're using this for pet food, you're going to need more animals to get that 1 kilogram of byproducts than the 1 kilogram of human grade meat. More animals obviously means greater environmental impacts. So what do we do about this? How should we think about this? I think this means we actually need to reframe the way we think about these ingredients and reframe the way we think about animal companion diets. I think choosing to think of these ingredients as animal byproducts has sort of allowed us to think of them as an externalized non-issue. We've said that the environmental impacts are negligible. We don't have to worry about this group of animals and their impacts. Actually, instead, I think we should be seeing these ingredients as animal co-products. These are ingredients that contribute to animal agricultural profits, really importantly, and they're valuable commodities in and of themselves. They're not externalized byproducts. These seem to have significant impacts on the climate, and they seem to have greater impacts than human-grade meat used in pet food. I'll now pass over to Andrew to give a bit more color on one of the studies that he did on this topic, and I'll then come back up at the end.
So just to explain how I got into this study and what I found, I started, as Billy mentioned, with the point that a third of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are due to the food system and about 20% are due to the food animal sector, the livestock sector. And we had that wonderful study by Ockham, which was about the first major study to look at the environmental impacts of pet food. Ockham from the University of California, Berkeley in 2017. And the key part was, as Billy mentioned, 25 to 30% of the environmental impacts from animal production in the US are actually due to pet food, not people. So if we look at the bottom end of that range, say just 25%, and we apply it to the previous slide, we know 20% of all emissions are due to the food sector. A quarter of that's 5%. This would indicate that 5% of all the CO2 emission equivalents are due to pet food. Now, let's stop and think for a sec. We know that 13.5%, or it's been calculated, 13.5% of all emissions are due to the transportation sector. So all of the planes, trucks, cars, buses in the world. There are armies of people working on sustainable transport solutions. We have something that on the face of it could be responsible for 5%. How many people are working on solutions to this? Well, there's myself, there's Billy, when I can get his time, and there's a few other people doing bits and pieces around the world, companies developing alternative pet foods, and that's it globally. So this is one of the most neglected, potentially beneficial areas in our entire movement, to be honest. This may not quite be 5% because pet ownership's higher in the US than the global average, but also they didn't account for byproducts properly, meaning their figure might be too low, but it indicates that it's something substantial. So there have been several studies describing the paw print of pet foods, but nobody said, well, hang on, what benefits would accrue if the world's population of dogs and cats were switched to nutritionally sound vegan diets? So I said, well, they also have impacts, but they're lower. What would the difference be? What would the benefits be? So I set to calculate them. Number of food animals you'd no longer need to kill in the food system each year. What would the savings be in land, water, fossil fuels, pesticides and fertilizers, greenhouse gases? And what were all the food energy savings, because you're not wasting so much food energy by passing it through livestock animals to produce meat and so on. How many additional people could you actually feed? It wasn't possible to do a study like this until 2020, when for the first time we actually got publicly available information about the ingredients used in pet food on a large scale. a report came out giving us information about 2/3 of all the ingredients in the entire US pet food market, which is the biggest one in the world. Now we had information about more than 500 ingredients, so we knew the livestock animal species, tonnages, plant-based ingredients, and so on. So I had access to that. I worked out the dietary energy needs for the US population of dogs, cats, and humans, and how much of that was supplied by animal sources. I worked out for all the animal-based ingredients, what were the environmental impacts, and then what would they be if plant-based ingredients were used instead. And I got this information which is on this wonderful graphic, which is actually on the table over there if you want to take away a copy afterwards. So as Billy mentioned, in the US, it turns out that only 80% of food animal consumption is for people and 20% is for dogs and cats. And that's probably also true of the UK and other wealthy nations with high pet ownership. Globally, it's 91% humans and 9% dogs and cats. And in 2018, the most recent year where we had reliable global numbers of dogs and cats, that was 71 billion land animals being killed to feed people, 6 billion to feed dogs, and about 1 billion to feed cats, and it would be higher today. And you can see the breakdown by species there, 78 billion land animals killed in the food system, most of them poultry, and you can see the numbers killed to feed dogs and cats if you want specifics. Now, if we were to swap all these animals onto nutritionally sound vegan diets, this is what we'd save in terms of greenhouse gases. The first column is dogs, then we have cats and humans. Greenhouse gases you would spare if all the world's pet dogs were switched exceeds the total greenhouse gas produced by the United Kingdom by 1.5 times. There'd be massive land savings. For example, if all the humans were to switch, you would free up land bigger than Russia, the world's largest country, combined with India, which would then become available for reforestation, carbon capture, and biodiversity increase. There'd be massive savings of fresh water, and the food energy savings, if all the world's cats switch, you could feed 69.7 million additional people, which is bigger than the human population of the UK. If the dogs switched, you could feed almost 450 million additional people, which is bigger than the population of the EU. And if the humans were to switch, you could feed 5.3 billion additional people, which is 2/3 of the current population of the Earth. All of this is actually conservative. There's reason to believe that actually you could feed more people than these and the environmental benefits would be bigger. But I picked the most conservative outcomes. And as you can see, despite that, they're massive. This is game-changingly large. So I published that just just over a year ago now, actually, in, again, PLOS One. And we've published a summary of that, as Billy mentioned, along with the other environmental implications of different dietary choices of dogs and cats in Plant-Based News just a very short time ago, and we've got that actually as a handout on the table there, so please do take a copy of that as well. I just want to draw your attention to a couple more studies in this field. Some colleagues and I actually systematically reviewed the scientific literature looking for all solutions to the climate change problem that have been published in the scientific literature in the last 20 years. And we identified that we obviously need to change fossil fuel consumption and production, transportation systems, built environment, but absolutely the food system. It's one of the major things that we have to do to address the challenges of climate change, environmental degradation, and biodiversity loss. We published a short summary of that recently in Oxford Open Climate Change. And then this just came out about 2 weeks ago. This is super exciting. This is a study showing that when you use modern climate accounting methods, actually it turns out that the food animal system, the livestock sector, the food animal sector, has produced the majority of all greenhouse gases to date, historically. It's about 53%, actually. So it's not the biggest contributor per year today, although it's certainly one of the top, but it has been the biggest contributor historically so far. So the impacts of the food system, particularly the livestock sector, are massive. And what my research has shown is that we have been completely being human-centric. We've had a blind spot when we've assumed that that only relates to the human food system. Actually, the pet food system is a major part of this as well, and we do need to be addressing it. So we now have this body of research satisfying the top 5 concerns that our surveyed pet guardians said that they had before they'd be willing to consider vegan and other alternative diets. So the evidence is there to support their concerns and the change that we need to see in this sector. the diets are now available too. So this field is ripe for change. It's really interesting to remember that although this shows a very rapid increase in global valuation of this sector, this reflects survey data based upon a population of pet owners that almost entirely doesn't know what I've just told you. So I think once they find out that these diets exist, are more widely available than perhaps they thought, and that all this evidence now exists to support their top 5 concerns about these diets, actually this is going to go up even more quickly. So I think this sector has a bright future. Just want to close with a couple of key recommendations I always make. It's really important that we don't go home and attempt to just make our own vegan diets and feed them to dogs and cats ourselves. It is possible to buy recipes and supplements and to try to do that, but unless you're an expert, there have been quite a few studies showing that unfortunately the results are often nutritionally unsound. So what I recommend people do is purchase diets from one of the reputable pet food manufacturers that hopefully are working with veterinary nutritionists or other nutritional experts to formulate diets that are nutritionally sound. And it should say somewhere on the labeling, nutritionally complete for dogs or cats. The company should be able to provide some basic information about steps they've taken to ensure nutritional soundness, whether they formulate the diet to meet the nutritional requirements of US or European authorities, for example. If they have no information, won't answer questions, that should be a red flag. Choose another company. Secondly, even if your dog is one of these ultra enthusiastic ones that just wolfs down all its food, or whether it's a very fussy old dog or cat that's been fixated on a diet that's been eating for the last 10 or 15 years, either way, I recommend a gradual dietary transition if you can, over at least a couple of weeks to allow time for the digestive enzymes and the bacteria in the gastrointestinal system to transition. There'll be less chance of adverse reactions such as diarrhea if you do that. Don't stress if you don't get 100% of the way to a full transition. Even if you only get, e.g., 50% in 6 months, that's going to do potentially quite significant benefits for the health of your dog and cat and some major environmental benefits as too. You don't necessarily need to get 100% of the way there, although many people do successfully achieve that. Just like to thank co-authors of my various studies, most of who are statisticians. My funding sources, including Food System Research Fund, representing animals and ProVeg International, and a couple of pet food companies who provided some of the grants back in the beginning that helped me to get started on all this research. I don't have 4,000 friends on social media, so to reach that many pet guardians, I relied upon a small army of volunteers and companies to help me do the largest survey of pet owners in this field so far. So I'm very grateful to them. And Billy, this is for you.
I won't dwell on this because I know we've got and I hope we can answer at least 1 or 2 questions. But look, the main point that I think we both want to make here is that this is a severely under-communicated element of the protein transition. And as animal advocates, I think we all have a responsibility to meet that gap and advocate for this neglected and tractable portion of dietary change. If you're interested in learning more, of course, please do read the handouts. It's on plant-based news as well, so you can look it up there. If you scan the QR code, you'll be able to see my slides as well, if that's of interest to you. And of course, please do come and speak to us afterwards if we can't answer your questions now. Andrew, is that all from you? Yes, absolutely. Please go to sustainablepetfood.info. This is an excellent, very comprehensive resource base that I've used many times. So most of the questions will have answers there as well. Lou, do we have any time for questions now?
Yes, I think we can have
excellent.
1 question, maybe 2, let's see. We have a couple of questions, so maybe I'll just summarize them. Could one of you please clarify how cats, an animal that we know as carnivorous, can possibly thrive on a vegan diet?
Yep, we need to remember that cats, dogs, humans, Martians, none of them would have requirements for any particular ingredient. What they all have is requirements for certain nutrients. Nutrients and ingredients are not the same thing. So if we formulate a diet to supply all the necessary nutrients, we should expect the animal to do as well. And by the way, if we cut out dietary hazards, and the most common ones are animal-sourced allergens, we might see some health benefits, such as a reduction in gastrointestinal problems, itchy skin, ear canal problems, which is actually what the studies consistently show. Health benefits are very common, and they're the sorts of benefits that occur. So yes, you need to formulate a diet correctly using veterinary nutritional specialists to fully supplement it to make sure that it does include all the nutrients that cats require. No species has a requirement for any particular ingredient. They require nutrients.
Thank you. Andrew, why do you think the veterinary profession is so resistant to the idea of vegan pet food?
Fortunately, in the United Kingdom, the veterinary profession has pretty much flipped around. But what used to be the case is that pet owners would go home and attempt to make their own diets, which would often be nutritionally unsound, and then vets would have to deal with the consequences. So vets are very suspicious of alternative diets that haven't been well made by good companies of all kinds. What the vets generally don't know is just in the last 3 years, there's been this explosion of these new vegan pet diets, which are made by good companies and nutritionally sound, and there are a lot of those are on the table that you can go and have a look at shortly. And also, in the last 3 years, virtually all of the research in this field has been published. So there's now this large body of health studies showing good health outcomes for dogs and cats fed these diets, good behavioural outcomes, environmental benefits, and so on. The veterinary profession hasn't actually known about this because it's so recent. However, I've been actually publishing summaries in the veterinary news journals in the United Kingdom, lobbying the British Veterinary Association, who have now come out in support. They've reversed their previous opposition to vegan diets for dogs. They now officially support these diets for dogs, providing that they are nutritionally sound. So that's the UK. There's wide awareness amongst vets here, and it's pretty positive now. Internationally, not so much. This is why we need more people working on this than just myself and Billy. We need to actually, any of you guys that want to actually help us get the word out, especially internationally, please do come talk to us afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Billy. That's all we have time for. Another big round of applause.